Okay, let's unpack this. If you ask someone today where to find the divine or, the sacred, they'll probably point you towards something highly structured.
Right, like a holy text or a rigid philosophical framework.
Exactly. Or maybe a massive organized institution with a very clear hierarchy and a strict set of rules. We are basically used to religion being categorized and well managed.
Yeah, the modern approach to the sacred is deeply analytical. We expect theology to fit into these neat, logical boxes.
But if you rewind a few thousand years and you step into the ancient Mediterranean world, looking for the divine was less like reading a spreadsheet and more like walking into a wild, untamed
Oh,
forest.
absolutely.
You were looking at a landscape where sacred power lived in roaring springs, in dark caves, in the roots of trees. And our mission for you today is to track one of the most monumental paradigm shifts in human history. We want to see how society moved from worshiping raw, nature-based goddess cults to relying on highly structured, abstract, and male-dominated religious systems.
And the timeline we are looking at here spans centuries. I think it is vital to understand that this was not a sudden overnight
We're
takeover.
not just a flip of a switch.
Exactly. You're going to see a slow, creeping evolution where the divine feminine was gradually absorbed, then demoted, and eventually replaced entirely by abstract reason and male institutions.
So to really get our heads around this shift, I want to start by picturing what early goddess worship actually looked like on the ground. Because if you and I lived back then, our experience of the divine was deeply physically tied to the earth.
It was incredibly tangible.
Let's look at the goddess Leto. Today, people mostly just know her from the later myths as the mother of the famous twins, Apollo and Artemis. But early worship of Leto didn't use those grand, lifelike, perfectly sculpted marble statues we associate with classical ancient Greece, did it?
No, not at all. The earliest physical representations of Leto, and honestly many other ancient goddesses, were known as Soana.
Zoana.
Right. And these were essentially shapeless, roughly carved wooden blocks or pillars. They were not kept in gleaming urban temples. They were situated out in rural landscapes, out in the open plains or deep in the woods.
I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of an ancient pilgrim here. I mean, what does it actually feel like to pray to a shapeless piece of wood instead of a beautiful marble face? Kind of reminds me of abstract modern art.
That's a great way to think about it.
Because the lack of human features on those blocks wasn't a lack of skill from the ancient carver, right? It feels like a deliberate statement that the goddess's power was as wild and unshaped as nature itself.
That is exactly the mindset. The divine was not supposed to look like you. It was supposed to terrify and awe you with its boundless potential.
Wow.
In places like Crete, Leto was honored under a very specific title, Pythia, which translates to the grafter or the creator.
The grafter, like
Yeah.
a botanical term.
Exactly. This is a raw agricultural term. It refers to the physical act of grafting a new branch onto a living tree. So she represented nature's unique, visceral power to physically transform living things.
Which brings us to a phenomenal story from our sources, featuring the first of three very different figures named Leucippus that we're going to talk about today.
Right. This myth is fascinating.
This first Leucippus myth is intense. There's a woman named Galatea, and she becomes pregnant. Her husband, Lampris, gives her this horrifying ultimatum. He basically says, if it's a girl, expose her to the elements. I only want a male heir.
A very harsh reality of the ancient world.
Yeah. So Galatea gives birth to a girl, but she's desperate to save her. So she hides the child, raises her as a boy, and names her Leucippus.
But children inevitably grow, right? And physical biology cannot be hidden forever. A crisis point arrives where the disguise is just going to fail.
Exactly. Terrified of her husband finding out and killing the child, Galatea flees to the rural sanctuary of Leto. She begs the goddess for a miracle. And Leto, acting as the grafter, physically transforms the child into a biological male.
And you really have to notice how the myth reinforces the goddess's absolute dominion over biology.
Right.
The city of Phaistos actually celebrated this specific myth with a major coming-of-age festival called the Ecdysia.
And what happened at that festival?
Well, during this ritual, young people would strip off their childhood clothing, echoing the moment Leucippus cast off a female veil to reveal a new male body.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, young men would put on female clothing first, then publicly take it off to put on male military armor. It signified their transition into adult citizens, but it was all facilitated by the power of the earth goddess.
I am just fascinated by the cultural weight of that festival. If you are participating in the Ecdysia, you are acknowledging that this earth goddess holds ultimate, terrifying power over biology, gender, and identity.
Absolutely.
But as we move forward in history, that unshaped wild power starts to look dangerous to the men running the growing city-states.
It does. As societies became more complex and, frankly, more patriarchal, that wild biological unpredictability was viewed as a threat. It needed to be colonized and managed.
Right.
The transition away from the earth goddesses was driven by a need for predictable, rational structures.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We can see that institutional takeover perfectly encapsulated in the most famous religious site in the ancient Mediterranean world, the Oracle of Delphi.
Delphi is the ultimate turning point in our deep dive today.
Because it wasn't always Apollo's, was it?
No. Originally, that sanctuary belonged to the oldest earth deities, specifically Gaia. The site was guarded by a supernatural serpent or dragon named Python, a literal creature of the earth. But then, the myth introduces the male god Apollo. Apollo represents everything the new patriarchal society values: light, healing, mathematics, music, and above all, reason.
So he comes in and cleans house.
Pretty much. Apollo travels to Delphi, slaughters Python, the ancient earth spirit, and claims the sacred site for his own institution.
And the female priestess who operates the Oracle at Delphi becomes known as the Pythia, which literally translates to the woman of Python.
Exactly.
Her very title is a morbid trophy. It's a constant reminder of a male solar god conquering a female-aligned earth spirit.
And the sacred feminine didn't vanish from Delphi, right? It was subjugated, it became a vessel. The local earth spirits lost their autonomy to a universal male deity.
You just became mouthpieces.
Yes, the female voice of the Pythia still echoed in the chamber, but Apollo was declared the ultimate author of the prophecies.
I am really struggling to square this with the rest of Apollo's mythology, though, specifically his birth. Leto, pregnant with Apollo and Artemis, is cursed to wander the earth, finally finding sanctuary on the island of Delos. She labors in pure agony for 9 days and nights.
The notoriously brutal birth myth.
Yeah. And her firstborn, Artemis, emerges fully formed and immediately has to act as a midwife to deliver her twin brother, Apollo. If the women Leto and Artemis are doing literally all of the agonizing, traumatic labor, how does Apollo end up looking like the hero who gets the permanent, incredibly lucrative franchise at Delphi?
Well, the trauma of that birth is central to understanding the shifting gender dynamics here.
Yeah.
Witnessing the excruciating reality of female labor shapes the goddess Artemis forever.
How so?
She is so profoundly disturbed by the biological suffering of women that she begs Zeus to grant her eternal virginity. She completely opts out of the biological reproductive process just to maintain her independence.
So Artemis, a female goddess, looks at the biological reality of womanhood and decides the only way to stay autonomous is to entirely reject her own biology.
That is incredibly bleak.
It is bleak, but it reveals the patriarchal view of the female body. Once women were reduced to mere vessels for a male god's voice at Delphi, their physical bodies were no longer revered as sources of creation.
Right.
They became liabilities. The institution had to tightly control the women who served it.
Which leads to a massive practical shift in who actually gets to be the Pythia. Because originally, the priestess was always a young maiden, right?
She was. But Herodotus and other sources tell us about a really dark incident. A visitor from Thessaly arrives at Delphi, becomes infatuated with a young Pythia, and either abducts or assaults her.
Which is horrific.
It caused an absolute panic within the Delphic priesthood. It highlighted the physical vulnerability of placing a young woman in such a highly visible, powerful role. I mean, a role where she was interacting constantly with kings, generals, and diplomats who were basically used to taking whatever they wanted. So how does the institution handle it? Because looking at the text, they don't respond by fortifying the sanctuary or punishing the attackers.
No, they don't.
They basically decide the woman's physical body is the problem. They implement a strict age restriction policy. From that day on, the Pythia had to be a woman over 50.
The shifting of the blame is glaring.
It's like a modern corporate PR crisis response.
Yeah, but the most telling detail is the dress code. Even though the Pythia was now a woman over 50, the priests forced her to wear the clothing of a young maiden to symbolize ritual purity.
Wow.
They demanded the aesthetic image of the youthful, pure vessel, but they wanted to mitigate the physical risk to their institution's reputation.
I'm looking at our sources, specifically the second Leucippus myth, and I have to ask, what is driving this obsessive need to control women's bodies and spaces?
It's a deep-seated fear.
In this myth, a completely different man named Leucippus falls in love with Daphne, who is a follower of Artemis. Daphne's group is an all-female virgin hunting community living deep in the wild. Leucippus disguises himself as a woman to infiltrate their sacred space.
Right, the disguise allows him to bypass their defenses. But it is Apollo, again, the god of reason and order, who exposes the deception. Apollo puts it into the minds of the women to stop and bathe in a river, forcing them to undress, which immediately reveals Leucippus's true sex.
And the reaction is explosive. The moment the women realize a man has invaded their sanctuary, they don't just chase him away. They take their hunting spears and brutally murder him.
It's a very violent unmasking.
Yeah. Why is it so incredibly violent? Is this a genuine reflection of female empowerment, or is this ancient male anxiety about autonomous women?
It is overwhelmingly a reflection of male anxiety. The myth acts as a cultural warning against crossing gender boundaries, but it also reveals a deep terror of unmanaged female spaces.
Unmanaged by men, you mean?
Precisely. A group of women operating outside the control of the city-state, outside of marriage, was viewed as inherently dangerous. The violence in the myth justifies the patriarchal society's belief that women needed to be overseen by men, or else chaos and bloodshed would follow.
This institutional anxiety about female religious power wasn't just isolated to the Greeks, though. You see a massive regional negotiation across the entire Mediterranean over who actually gets to speak for the divine.
You do. If you look at the neighboring cultures, particularly the Old Testament prophets like Samuel, Isaiah, or Jeremiah, you see a very similar mechanism of divine communication.
How so?
Well, both the Greek Pythia and the biblical prophets served as intermediaries. The divine world communicated through chosen messengers, utilizing dreams, visions, or ecstatic altered states.
And both traditions featured intermediaries who loved delivering famously ambiguous messages to powerful kings.
Wow, they loved a good riddle.
Yeah, the classic example is the Pythia telling King Croesus of Lydia that if he went to war, a great empire would fall. She just conveniently left out the detail that the empire destined to fall was his own.
Right, the ambiguity forced the listener into a state of interpretation. But the gender dynamics between the cultures offer a fascinating contrast.
Right, because in the biblical tradition, there certainly are female prophets like Miriam, Deborah, Huldah, but they are the rare exceptions.
Yes, they exist within a prophetic tradition that is overwhelmingly male.
While over in Greece, the absolute highest prophetic office in the known world, the Oracle of Delphi, was held exclusively by women for over 1,200 years.
True. However, you have to look closely at the architecture of that power. Yes, the Pythia was a woman, but she was entirely surrounded, managed, and controlled by a male priestly hierarchy.
Help me understand the mechanics of this oracle reading, because I think this is where the illusion of power really breaks down. The Pythia is sitting in an underground chamber, inhaling fumes, entering an ecstatic trance, and speaking. But she isn't writing down the prophecies to hand to the kings, is she?
No, she's not.
So how much of the final delivered message is actually her voice, and how much is the male priesthood editing and translating her trance into official state policy?
That is the structural genius of the Delphic system. The woman provided the raw biological connection to the divine, but the men controlled the narrative output.
Wow.
The priests interpreted her utterances, formatted them into poetic meter, and delivered them to the clients. The men were the editors of the divine voice.
But eventually, even acting as the editors wasn't enough for the men running these societies. Once the priesthood had total physical control over the oracle, the intellectuals in society started looking at the whole mythological setup and asking, is this even real?
Which triggers a total philosophical revolution.
Exactly.
The desire for control naturally evolves into a desire for intellectual mastery. Society wanted to move away from messy, unpredictable nature spirits entirely.
This introduces our third and final Leucippus from the sources. Leucippus the philosopher, who, along with his student Democritus, introduces the theory of atomism.
A staggering leap in human thought.
It really is. They argue that life, death, and the entire universe are just eternal atoms combining and separating in an infinite void.
Atomism is a radically material explanation of existence. They famously declared that nothing occurs at random, but everything happens from reason and necessity.
So no gods pulling the strings.
Exactly. For the atomists, there was no divine intervention whatsoever. When you die, your soul atoms simply disperse back into the cosmos.
It's like seeing the falling green code in the Matrix. They're looking at the sacred springs, the dark caves, and the ancient wooden blocks, and they're literally stripping all the magic and mystery out of the soil. They replace the shape-shifting earth goddesses with cold, hard physics.
The atomists threatened to erase the divine entirely. But then we see a massive counter-movement led by Socrates.
Right.
Socrates completely rejected the atomist idea that everything was just blind mechanical collisions. He argued for the existence of a divine mind, a purposeful, rational intelligence guiding the cosmos.
I always thought of Socrates as this great defender of wisdom. But looking at our sources, the way he defends the divine is by heavily abstracting the traditional gods.
He does. He takes these raw, passionate, physical deities and turns them into mental concepts.
Right. He argues that Aphrodite isn't a literal goddess emerging from the sea foam. She's just the philosophical concept of pleasure. The Muses aren't women living on a mountain. They are metaphors for inspiration. By turning these physical, earthy goddesses into abstract concepts, is Socrates actually doing more damage to the old goddess cults than the atomists did?
Well, he fundamentally dismantled their original purpose. By turning the gods into metaphors, Socrates removed the need for physical sacred spaces.
Oh, that makes sense.
If Aphrodite is just an idea in your mind, you don't need a sacred spring, you don't need an ancient wooden suganon, and you certainly don't need a female priestess to mediate your connection to her. Socrates shifted the focus of religion from physical ritual devotion to internal self-examination.
It's ironic because Socrates' entire philosophical mission was supposedly kickstarted by the Oracle at Delphi. His friend traveled there and asked the Pythia if anyone was wiser than Socrates, and the priestess said no one was.
And Socrates was famously baffled by this declaration. He spent years aggressively questioning politicians and poets in Athens, trying to prove the oracle wrong, only to realize that everyone claiming to be wise was actually foolish.
So he proved her right.
Yeah, he finally concluded the oracle meant he was wise only because he alone recognized his own profound ignorance.
Though our sources point out that the historian Xenophon had a totally different read on that event.
He did, yes.
Xenophon claimed the oracle wasn't praising Socrates for some clever intellectual paradox about ignorance. He argued the oracle praised Socrates for his strict moral character, specifically that he was the most just and temperate man because he ruthlessly controlled his physical body and his earthly desires.
And regardless of which interpretation you favor,
Yeah.
both frame Socrates as a man who prioritized the internal rational mind over the messy physical body.
Right.
But this abstraction made the general public incredibly suspicious of him. The playwright Aristophanes mercilessly mocked Socrates in his play The Clouds, portraying him as a bizarre eccentric who literally floated in a basket above the city, worshipping abstract concepts like the clouds and the void instead of the traditional grounded gods of Athens.
That rising tension between the ancient earthbound religion and this new wave of abstract universal philosophy inevitably leads to the literal collapse of the oracle system itself. And we have an incredible primary source who witnessed this decline firsthand, the historian Plutarch.
Plutarch is a vital voice here because he actually served as a high priest at Delphi during the Roman era, around 100 CE.
So he was on the inside.
Very much an institutional insider. And he can see that the fires of the oracle are dying out. Fewer people are coming, the prophecies are less potent.
Plutarch tries desperately to reconcile the physical natural world with this new philosophical demand for a rational divine mind. He investigates the local legends about how the oracle was first discovered. The story goes that a shepherd found the site because geological vapors rising from a fissure in the earth were making his goats act erratically.
But Plutarch refuses to be a simple materialist like the atomists. He uses the philosophical concept of teleology, the study of ultimate purpose or design.
Okay.
Plutarch doesn't think it's just random swamp gas making people dizzy. He argues that the earth itself was biologically designed by a divine mind to emit these specific vapors solely to trigger human prophecy.
It's a fascinating compromise. The biology is just the instrument for the intellect.
Exactly. He compares the geological vapor to a drug, but insists it acts merely as a spark, an enkindling. And because he views it through this highly structured, rational lens, Plutarch argues that the human soul of the Pythia must be perfectly adjusted to receive this divine spark safely.
The metaphor I keep coming back to is electrical wiring. It's like plugging a standard kitchen toaster into a high-voltage city power line.
That's a great way to picture it.
If the physical resistance of the appliance isn't perfectly calibrated to the current, the whole thing just violently blows up.
That is a perfect analogy for Plutarch's worldview. The human vessel must be prepared, purified, and in total harmony with the natural environment. And Plutarch recounts a horrific, incredibly tragic historical incident to prove exactly what happens when the patriarchal institution ignores the limits of the female body.
This story from his writings is incredibly dark. A VIP delegation arrives at Delphi demanding a prophecy. But the Pythia is distraught. She isn't mentally or physically ready. The priests perform the traditional test. They pour cold water on a sacrificial animal to see if it shivers. If it shivers, the omens are good and the god is present.
But the animal is completely unresponsive, the omens are terrible, the environmental and spiritual conditions are absolutely entirely wrong for a reading.
But the priests, who rely on the political patronage of these VIPs, refuse to accept the physical reality of the situation. They literally drench the poor animal with water until it is practically drowning and forced to physically react. They fake the omen,
The pure corruption.
and then they force the reluctant, unready priestess down into the underground chamber.
Plutarch writes that she was forced in unwillingly and half-heartedly. The institution demanded a product regardless of the vessel's condition.
And what happens?
The result is a catastrophic physical and psychological breakdown. As soon as she begins, her voice changes to a terrifying shriek. She rushes screaming from the sanctuary, collapses in the courtyard, and dies shortly after.
They built this massive, incredibly wealthy institution to harness and control the raw, ancient power of the Earth Goddess. And in the end, their own rigid political demands are exactly what destroyed the woman they forced to channel it.
It represents the ultimate failure of the patriarchal structure to respect the natural world. By Plutarch's time, it is widely recognized that the divine power is not ageless. It waxes and wanes with the earth.
Right.
When the priests abandoned the delicate harmony between the natural environment and the human mind, when they tried to force nature to behave like a predictable machine, the result wasn't divine wisdom. It was chaos and death.
It is a staggering journey we have tracked for you today. I mean, think about where we started. We began with the raw, shape-shifting nature magic of Leto. We looked at her shapeless wooden blocks standing out in the wild, untamed fields of Crete, where the divine was an unpredictable force of biology and transformation.
And we traced how that autonomous power was corralled and colonized at Delphi, where a universal male god of reason took over the sacred landscape. The female voice was retained, but it was tightly controlled, aged up, heavily managed, and heavily edited by men.
And we followed that thread all the way to the cold, abstract reasoning of Socrates and the atomists. We watched as the living, breathing world was intellectually dissected into a mathematical equation of eternal atoms or turned into abstract concepts that existed only in the mind.
What you have seen today is that the transition from female to male authority in the ancient Mediterranean was not just a shift in gender politics. It was a fundamental structural shift in how humanity viewed its place in the universe. We moved from seeing ourselves as an integrated, vulnerable part of a living, unpredictable natural world to placing ourselves at the top of a structured, rational, and highly managed hierarchy.
We traded the wild forest for the spreadsheet. We traded the messy reality of the earth for the safety of the mind. And that leaves us with a final thought for you to chew on, something that builds on everything we've explored today in this deep dive. If our ancient ancestors traded their deep, intuitive connection to the living earth for the safety of structured, rational institutions, what vital, subtle signals from the natural world are you and I entirely ignoring today, simply because they don't fit neatly into a data set or a philosophical debate?